I'm Mike Gitlin. Welcome to another edition of our monthly Capital Ideas podcast, where we get to know the people behind the portfolios. And we meet with our portfolio managers and analysts and get to hear what makes them unique. We hear some of their ideas and a bit more about Capital Group. Today, I'm joined by Jessica Spaley. Jessica is a portfolio manager at Capital Group. She has been here for 20 and a half years, and she is based in San Francisco. Welcome, Jessica.
Thanks, Mike. It's great to be here.
So before you joined us, you were doing M&A and private equity, and then you wind up at Capital Group 20 and a half years ago. So how'd you get here? Why'd you join, and who hired you?
Yeah. Well, as you said, I started out in investment banking right out of college, a great, first experience in the finance world, and then found my way to private equity, which was my first opportunity to invest in companies. And there was a lot I really liked about that. But in private equity, it's very transactional. It's, doing deals. So it's a pretty narrow window into different industries. And a lot of the time is spent sort of operationally, running businesses, trying to improve them. And when I went to business school, I kind of reflected on what I enjoyed about that job and what appealed to me about capital and investing in the public markets was really that broader view, that ability to look at an industry and buy any of the major companies in that industry and really see the full picture of what was happening in an industry, and to be able to make a decision to invest or not invest kind of every day of the week, to have that ability was a lot of fun.
Much broader remit.
Yeah, exactly. And frankly, some of the most interesting companies to study from my perspective are the big growth companies, the ones that have been, changing industries, changing the world. Those aren't the kind of companies you tend to look at in private equity, right? We have the ability to invest in those big, companies leading change in different industries.
So talking about a company that effectively not only changed its industry, but maybe have changed the world, Amazon. So 2006, you're looking at Amazon, and it's somewhere between an internet company and a retail company. It's selling books online. I understand today, 18 years later, it's still in your portfolio. So what did you see about Amazon 18 years ago?
Yeah, well, first, I was fortunate to get to cover it because a lot of the way, these disruptors have been defined is, an industry called the internet, which isn't really an industry. It's a mechanism for going to market. It's a channel. But that wasn't how most of the industry defined it. So you had, analysts covering kind of all the disruptors, whether it was, Amazon or Google or Uber, and then analysts covering sort of legacy companies that were in the industries those companies were trying to disrupt. In my case, my research director at the time, Will Robbins, kind of had the foresight to say, maybe the retail analyst should cover Amazon. This was 2006. It's more common, today to see that. And, initially Amazon really was just a bookseller, sold a little bit of electronics, and it wasn't obvious, what they were going to become. But a couple of years into covering it, that's when they came up with Amazon Prime. And that was sort of the genius that gave people a reason to shop them for everything. And that's when I decided to buy the company back in 2008 when we invested for the first time. And it's just been an incredible, thing to watch. And it also really helped us pick and choose the right traditional retail companies and understanding which ones could, succeed and thrive, with full understanding of what Amazon was doing and where it was going, to be able to navigate that, because there still are, plenty of winners in the brick and mortar world, but you had to choose carefully.
Massive disruptor.
Yeah.
And still is today in lots of ways. So thinking about retail, you were a retail analyst, and in the world of consumer, you have inside information. And I'm sure our lawyers will hate that term, but you have an 11-year-old, 14-year-old, and 17-year-old daughter. So you have information about what consumers like. In all seriousness, have they been helpful as you've looked at them as a bit of a consumer barometer? What do they see and what do you see through their eyes?
Yeah. I mean, I think one of the biggest risks when you're a consumer analyst is to over extrapolate your own personal experience or your generation, or, and so to have a different generation's perspective right in front of you is really helpful. It is quite different. They came up with their Christmas list this year, my 3 teenage and preteen daughters. And by the way, this is not a pen and paper Christmas list. It's a digital, with hyperlinks. Like, we're going to make this as easy as possible for you, Mom. Like, just
Right.
click here and
Click here and
buy.
order. Yeah,
Exactly.
buy here. Love that.
It's quite remarkable what they're able to put together. But I hadn't heard of any of the brands, 10, 15 items, all brands that didn't exist 5 years ago, all sort of Shopify-powered direct-to-consumer sites, all brands they discovered, on TikTok or some other digital channel. So it is, really different than what we experienced. On the other hand, if they actually have a little bit of money to spend, the first place they want to go is Target. They love the experience of shopping
Wow,
at
that's
Target.
interesting.
It's not just a transaction for them, it's an experience. It's fun. They want to buy some decor for their room, for a new season. And so it is interesting to see that there are certain concepts that seem to endure and still appeal, even as so much of what they're interested in doing is completely new.
Maybe they can be young entrepreneurs and start a business on how to share with your parents your list electronically.
Exactly.
I haven't seen that yet, but fortunately my kids are a lot older.
Remove all the friction.
Yeah, remove the friction. Just, click here and add to cart.
Exactly.
So we think about you as a retail analyst and then ultimately becoming a diversified portfolio manager. And retail is one thing, and then industrials, for example, is something very, very different. Talk a little bit about your transition to becoming a diversified PM.
Yeah, it's a fun and challenging one. I think we all tend to start with the lessons we learned over our many years of being an analyst for a particular sector. And so in retail, those lessons tended to be that winners, were able to create flywheels that, beget more success. And it was very hard for companies that were struggling to turn around. So that was one lesson I learned, is that, you could pay a little bit more for the winners because they were likely to endure longer than people expected. And in retail, there's sort of reasons why that's true. For example, in such a decentralized model where you're not running two factories, you're running thousands of stores with thousands of store managers, turning an operation like that around once it is struggling is very hard, and culture is dispersed across all these, remote endpoints. So there are reasons why that pattern held in retail, and carrying that over as you start to learn other industries. There are definitely areas where a lot of those lessons hold true. But then there are areas where you realize, an industry like industrials has a different, set of pattern recognition you need to learn. So there are many more examples of turnarounds that have worked in an industry like that. It is easier for a good operator to go in and sort of fix a set of problems. M&A is another thing that's really different. It tended to be in consumer companies. M&A was done out of defensive need. The sort of best companies grew organically. They didn't have a reason to do a lot of M&A. And so I became a pretty big M&A skeptic, even though my first job was working in M&A. And, you've learned that there are other industries where it's a huge way to create value. You can be a differentiatedly good acquirer of businesses. And I had to sort of get over some of my pattern recognition in retail to learn that, actually in some of these industrial businesses, that is what you want to look for. So it's a journey of figuring out what holds true in other industries and what doesn't.
So how long does the bias last? Meaning, if you start as a retail analyst and you become a diversified portfolio manager, your portfolio is probably overrepresented in retail to start because it's your comfort zone. It's what you know those companies. Is there a bias in your initial diversified portfolio, or do you pivot the other way and really lean into that diversified part of being a diversified PM?
Yeah, I think I leaned in not so much on just retail, but on, business models that I felt like I could understand and that, bore some resemblance to the type of businesses I learned. So maybe some of the areas that were initially harder to, get my arms around would be, banks or, energy companies. But I was more comfortable in some tech companies and healthcare companies because, sort of the business models and the ways that, companies created value seemed more parallel.
That makes sense.
So, and then over time, you brought into the more unfamiliar territory.
So one of your many roles here at Capital Group are investment professionals. I think some know and some don't, do a lot of things. They manage money, but you also help the company in other ways. And one of those is as a research director, which you were a research director. Part-time, you do that. It feels full-time, I know, but you do that and you manage money at the same time. Talk a little bit about that role as a research director and then how it makes you think differently about the capital system. Because the capital system is pretty unique. How did you find the role, and what did it tell you about the capital system?
Yeah. Well, it's awesome to be a research director, and I do think it gives you such a great window into the secret sauce of capital, which is that we really let people do things differently and figure out how they work best. We don't sort of say you have to look at this many companies, write your reports in these ways, do your models in these ways, have this amount of output. We're not formulaic in any way. And what you see when you're a research director is just how people's great insights come out in all these different ways. Some people love to write long reports. That's how they get their thoughts out. Other people really struggle to communicate that way. But if you pick up the phone, and talk to them, you get this wealth of insight and knowledge. And being a research director and getting the feedback from so many PMs really highlights that, because you find one PM saying, I don't know, I'm having a hard time, working with this person, and someone else saying, gosh, if you go visit a company with this analyst, it'll be, the most you've ever learned. And so that helped me when I became a PM, because I really understood, you can't kind of go into it saying, I need to be served this way, give me what I need exactly in this way. I mean, you can do that, but you'll miss,
not going to be the most
you'll miss what
way.
makes,
Sure.
Really how to find how our analysts are great. And so I was lucky, I feel like, to have that early experience that helped me in the PM role see that.
And how many years were you a research director?
5.
4 or 5?
It's about
5?
typical, yeah.
Okay, and so part-time therapist, coach, mentor, there's lots of different parts of that.
Indeed.
And I think the important thing is it's not one size fits all. And that individuality, I remember in fixed income in my early days at Capital Group, someone had come into my office and said, do you mind if I travel here to see this company? And I quickly reminded them, I'm not the travel department.
Yeah.
You go and do what you feel is best to do your research to come out with great decisions. So that individuality is pretty unique.
Yeah, it is.
One of the things, and you are our third guest on this podcast, so one of the things we've done historically is we go into your office. Now you're in San Francisco, so we go into your office and we find something there that we think has a story to it. So I will take it out of this interesting box. We have both listeners and viewers. And it's a letter from Herbert R. Black Jr. in very old school cursive. So it doesn't have a date that it was written. It just says Thursday. So it is up on the screen now for those who are watching. But for those who are listening, can you tell us a little bit about why you had this letter in your office and what it means to you as a person, not a portfolio manager?
Yeah, that's funny. The Thursday part, I hadn't remembered that. So this is my husband Eric's uncle Herb, and my husband's grandfather, Herb's father, is also named Herb, and Grandpa Herb lived in a small town in Michigan. Charlotte was the name of the town, and he ran a store, Gamble's hardware store. And when he passed away, he left some money, not a huge amount. He was, a storekeeper, to Uncle Herb and the 5 siblings, including my mother-in-law, my husband's mom. And a few years into my time at Capital, I got this note from Uncle Herb. And basically this note said, the money that my father, Grandpa Herb, left for us is invested in American funds, is invested in Growth Fund of America. And, how cool to see that you're helping manage that money. And so, of course, the reason I kept this is it's just such a powerful reminder of, what we do and who we're trying to, whose lives we're trying to improve and how we're trying to do it. And it just brought it home and made it very real for me.
It's such a great story. It is very real. There's tens of millions of individuals we impact, and to have your husband's uncle find you as one of the portfolio managers in the strategy they're invested in, I think that's fantastic. Thank you for sharing that. I want to get a little bit into your ideas today, and you manage in several strategies. One of them happens to be our oldest strategy. We just celebrated its 90th anniversary as a strategy. Maybe give a few ideas. What do you like today? We don't speak about anything that's an open order, but where are you finding opportunity?
Yeah. Well, I think it's hard to be an investor today and not think a lot about artificial intelligence. And I definitely, am of the view that, if we're going to invest over a long time horizon, we have to figure out these big trends that are going to matter over the next 10 years, even if you can't get the timing exactly right of when every piece is going to play out. And so that's an area that I spend a lot of time thinking about these days and really trying to figure out where is the value going to be captured, created, kept. And so there's a whole, stack you can think about from the, underlying hardware, the chips, that AI runs on, to the sort of platforms, whether it's language models or the clouds that, the AI is going to run in, the Amazon, Microsoft, Googles of the world. And then there's software companies that are going to build, things using AI and try to, monetize in their software tools. So all of that, is an area where I think there's a lot of excitement.
So a lot more beyond NVIDIA. NVIDIA is
exactly.
one,
I mean,
but
that's
there's
one.
the
That's
whole
that bottom.
ecosystem,
That
right?
bottom part of the stack, and that's certainly an area that's important. And there's lots of other companies in there, like Broadcom and Marvell. I mean, there's a whole, bunch of companies that are required to really make this AI run at scale. And so, that's an area of opportunity for sure. I think the next, interesting leg of that is actually going to be within every industry, which companies leverage AI to create differentiated competitive advantage, right? So if we look at the era of digital transformation, retail as an example, you saw different players, Home Depot embraced it early and that helped them drive success. And so I think that's going to play out later where we can say, outside of technology as an industry, where are companies creating a new path for themselves using AI? I think we're, early to be looking at that still. So that's a big area. Healthcare is an area that is a little bit out of favor right now, as some of the excitement of AI has taken off. But there's a lot of great, business models in that area. There's still a lot of innovation, whether it's in, the drug space or in the device space. A lot of interesting things, going on there, and a lot of, cost that really needs to be managed. And companies, whether it's United Health or, smaller companies that are trying to figure out how to create value, in the healthcare system or, save money in delivering all of this. And I think that's going to be a continued area of opportunity as well.
And so with all of the talk of the index itself being so heavily weighted towards very few names, you're finding a lot of opportunity outside of those. You may own some of them as well in your portfolio, but there's a lot of opportunity outside of those. And even though the market's rallied so much and we've reached all-time highs on the S&P recently, there's still plenty of idiosyncratic stocks that you can find that offer 10-year value.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think sometimes it's, the timing, the precise timing on some of these stock movements is always hard to get exactly right. But I think, looking out, I see lots of value and opportunity.
It's interesting. I think that it's the gift of time and being able to think long-term allows you to make better decisions. And
Yeah.
all that said, we all make mistakes. And when I ask portfolio managers to share a lesson learned, they always come back and say, there's so many, I don't know where to start. So it's a humbling industry we're in, but maybe share a lesson learned through a company you own that didn't work out the way you thought.
Well, there are many to choose from. I feel like the analyst mistakes are the ones that you really remember because as an analyst, you've brought a whole bunch of people along with your decisions. So those mistakes are particularly painful. So a couple that come to mind, would be Staples and Lululemon. And I think the common strand that often gets me into trouble in terms of mistakes is just being wrong about growth trajectory. And paying for a particular growth trajectory and then realizing that growth trajectory was different than we expected. Right. And I think there's a couple major reasons that can happen. Number one is disruption, and so I think that is really what happened in the case of Staples. We sort of I thought, they're focused on small business, what Amazon's doing over here. I made the judgment that it was, they were insulated because they focused on a business customer, and that proved to be incorrect. And so, if you were expecting a certain growth trajectory and then, really disruption has happened, that's extremely painful. It can also be overestimating, a company saturating its growth opportunity earlier than you thought, right? The addressable market, the addressable opportunity just being smaller than you thought, at least for what the company is offering today, right? And so Lululemon, that example was, they had kind of a particular, it was like the yoga pants, throughout the 2000s. They just kind of sold more and more and more of them. And that hit a wall sort of sooner than I expected. Turned out they were able to adapt and sort of, broaden their approach and kind of come up with Act Two and recovered from that. But it was quite painful when they had to sort of course correct in that way.
And in that example, so they have a product that's just a home run product.
Exactly.
And they're slow to diversify that product to others that are as successful or even close to that. And is there something that changes internally? Is there an epiphany of the senior most management? Do they change their product manager of the lineup? Like, how does that? Yeah. And that's obviously what you're trying to figure out is, can they make that pivot? How will they make that pivot? What happened at Lulu to change?
Well, it's rarely painless. There were a couple of CEO changes along the way in that journey. There was a lot of other management turnover. And so it took a lot of time to get that, back on a solid trajectory. And so, it varies by company, varies by life stage of company. I think, a company like Lululemon had grown so quickly, had such extraordinary success. There was just a bigger adjustment phase to kind of be able to be ready for that next phase of growth. In general, when companies have to kind of readjust because they've hit a certain wall, that process often takes longer and is a little more painful than we often anticipate at first.
Makes sense. How much do you let the macro environment play into your portfolio construction?
I don't factor it in a whole lot other than balance sheets, which I'll come back to. But it was interesting. When I first became a portfolio manager, it was 2018, and I did a lot of, backward-looking, analysis. And what was fascinating is, my back, this is really more like late 17 when I was doing this. My backward-looking sort of 10-year views, basically started at the market peak before the GFC. And yet, the GFC was essentially a blip in the stories of individual companies of, winners and losers and who had done well in different industries. Like, you barely noticed it on the chart. And that was quite a fascinating takeaway for me. Like, that was the GFC. Now, the exception would be if you owned a bank that had to raise capital at the bottom, or you owned something that went out of business, right? And so the lesson was like, you have to be able to survive a tough market. You can't have, a weak capital position or a weak balance sheet. But as long as you can check that box, like, that's not going to be the thing that matters in 5 to 10 years. That's not going to be the
liquidity.
thing. That's not going to be the story of your success or failure. So that's kind of my approach to investing. And I in this last sort of patch, 21, 22, I did get a little tougher on my approach to balance sheets, and companies that were investing for growth and not showing as much profitability right now. I was a little bit more forgiving of that in certain cases previously. So that's always an art to judge, but I'd say I don't want to compromise on that. I want to feel like any company I hold is going to survive a tough macro environment, but then I'm really focused on who's setting themselves up to win, in a structural, idiosyncratic, company-specific way, rather than trying to invest based on the macro.
So you talk about the art. I'll ask you about your investment edge. So I mentioned Rob said time. Carl Kawadja was our second guest, and Carl talked about his edge being a connector, which he is. He's an exceptional connector of people. What's your investment edge?
Yeah, I think, no surprise, as a product of my retail background, I would say it's kind of understanding and assessing moats, really digging in on what drives this company's ability to, continue to be successful, resilient to disruption, in the future. And, watching retail, you could see a lot of this was about how much value does someone extract from an ecosystem in return for how much value does it sort of create, right? Are you sort of over-earning in a broad sense of, there were retailers that were, they had 35, 40% gross margins in areas where it wasn't their own product. They were selling commoditized, other people's products. And, it turned out that was too much in an Amazon world. Like that was an unsustainable position to be in. And so the learning was sort of that was their vulnerability, and kind of applying that now to other industries to say, what do you really do that's unique? What are you sort of earning for that? Does it feel in balance, out of balance? And I'm willing to miss things. I always err on the side of caution there. So, if there's 5 companies where I'm worried about disruption, like I'm not going to invest in any 5, and it might only happen, to 1 or 2.
Sure.
But the pain is so severe that I'd rather be extra cautious on that front. So that's, I probably ask more questions about that than anyone in our investment group.
So it's barriers to, you talk about moats, but it's barriers to entry and more.
Yeah.
It's the kind of things where how will this company grow its share and become even more important in its opportunity set? Like back to the Lulu example, it morphs itself and becomes even bigger.
Right. And is what it's doing so different that, even over 5 or 10 years, no one's going to be able to replicate that. Why is that? Why can't someone do it better? Kind of all those questions, even if there's no evidence of that concern today.
So in 20 plus years, you've had mentors. Always difficult to pick out 1 or 2 folks that made a big difference in your career, but share 1 or 2 with us if you would.
Yeah, absolutely. So one would be Claudia Huntington, now retired, and she had been here I think for 40 years or something when she retired. So she was already incredibly experienced when I came in, and despite how experienced she was, she just had such a curiosity and respect for all the analysts and what they were learning. Like she didn't come at anything with I know how this is because I've been doing this for 30 years. It was like, what do you know? I want to learn from you. You're the analyst. And just always open-minded, about any investment. And then on top of that, when you'd be on the bus with her, going to see companies, her grown kids would call her and just want to talk. And I thought that is
a sign of success.
That is someone who has nailed it in life.
Right.
And then the other one would be Brad Vogt, who we unfortunately lost recently. And he just defined capital in terms of the capital system, the capital culture. He had, a very brave and independent investment mindset, and yet he leaned on the team so fully, and so he could simultaneously absorb everything that all of our other investors sort of were seeing and thinking and reflect on it, but still come up with his own independent view and be willing to do, the unpopular thing that no one else agreed with. And while doing that, always gave credit to everyone else on the team for his decision.
What's interesting about that, and Brad was remarkable. What's interesting is I was doing some research and I went back for you and I looked at 2011, and you had written a note on Amazon and you had said that you had just seen Amazon with Brad. So it's it's emotional to think about having just recently lost Brad, but his influence is still in the hallways for sure.
Absolutely.
We're going to finish up, and one of the things we like to do when we finish up is talk about something we're grateful for. Calling it an obsessively grateful moment. I'll start. Now that we're into our 3rd episode of what's really been a podcast that so many people internally helped on and create. I mean, we are here, but there are people who do so much behind the scenes that make this happen. I'm grateful for them. And I'm also grateful for so many folks who've embraced it, and the feedback we've had on it has just been remarkable. So I'm grateful for people who take the 30 minutes to get to know our investment professionals, because that's what this is all about, is sharing the capital system and the people behind the portfolio. So I'm grateful for them. Now it's your turn. So what are you grateful for?
Well, I mean, just, bringing up Claudia and Brad, and, my whole life is a story of, you need other people's, you need other people to succeed in life, right? We all like to attribute our success to, our own, I was so hardworking or I was so smart, but, that's not reality. And, I was someone who was able to attend the best schools in LA on financial aid, from the time I was 5. Like that just doesn't happen, because you're hardworking, right? Like somebody has to take an interest in you and decide, to try to be helpful. And I think I can think through every stage of my life, as we talked through banking and private equity and, coming to capital, and every step of the way, there's sort of someone who had to lean in and take an interest and try to be helpful. And, now that's something I try to give back. But even at this age, it's something, that I'm grateful for every day.
And I appreciate you sharing that. And I'm guessing you mentioned before your husband, Eric, I'm guessing he's grateful for Michigan for winning the national
Yes.
championship. If he were
Yes.
here, would that be the number one?
Yeah, he did not go to Michigan, but he grew up in Ann Arbor. His parents went to Michigan. We are very much a Michigan family. We went to the Ohio State game this year. So
Oh, you did?
It's been
Okay.
it's been a good year for the Michigan fans in the
Well,
world.
you can keep this. You don't need to share it with him, but it's an obsessively grateful mug, and I appreciate you coming here.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us, and I'm sure everyone will get a lot out
great.
of your stories. It's so helpful to get those perspectives, and I just enjoy working with you as well. Thank you for joining the podcast. Please subscribe to Capital Group on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts. Have a great day.